Welcome back everyone to our studies in AQA A-level history. This lesson is going to spend some time talking about the 1951 general election in more detail. Generally speaking, this next few videos are just going to be exploring some of the general elections that take place in this first topic, looking at the affluent society, the period of conservative rule between 1951 and 1964. And we're beginning, of course, with the 1951 general election, which of course took place in October 1951. Now, from a sort of general background and context, prior to 1951, since 1945 in fact, the government was run by the Labour Party under the leader and the Prime Minister Clement Attlee. He had been in office since 1945 and he had implemented a number of points that were to do with what became known as his reform agenda. And so by 1951, a lot of the things associated with his reform agenda, including the nationalisation of key industries and the introduction of the National Health Service in 1948, a lot of these things had already been implemented. But there were a number of issues. There were a number of mounting pressures associated with this period of history. There was, for example, the costs of the Korean War, there were rising balance of payments deficits, and there was the creeping costs of inflation. The result of which is that the Labour government had to introduce a number of austerity measures, cutting back on spending, cutting back on public services, in order to account for balance of payments deficits and the issue of inflation. We also see that the Chancellor, Hugh, introduces a number of charges on prescriptions, dentures and spectacles in early 1951. Now, if, as a sort of general word of advice to any potential political party that is in power at the moment, if you want to introduce a new tax essentially on certain parts of society, don't do it in the year of an election that is going to take place. That will not go down very well. That won't be very popular. More importantly, though, this introduction of charges on these different parts of what would be considered public health triggered the resignation of a number of left-wing ministers, including Honoran Bevan and, as well as that, Harold Wilson. We also see that there is a number of foreign policy falters. We see that Ernst Bevan's death, as well as Stafford Cripps' illnesses, as well as a number of embarrassing diplomatic issues, such as the Burgess-McLean defections, undermined public confidence in the Labour government. And so confidence in Labour was beginning to falter, essentially, by 1951, facing instability in government, and also with a very wafer-thin majority of only 5 seats from 1950 onwards. Attlee called a snap election in October 1951, before, in fact, King George VI embarked on a Commonwealth tour. And so the election campaign was very, very interesting. In terms of the position of Labour, they had campaigned quite energetically. Clement Attlee, for example, travelled by car extensively, allegedly covering around 2,000 miles in his car, or in a car, should I say, to rally support for the Labour campaign. The Conservatives at the time was led by Winston Churchill, that ran an upbeat campaign which emphasised the wartime leadership of Churchill, as well as a promise to end rationing, which had still taken place after the election, and still took place after the end of the Second World War. There was rationing for a good 5 to 10 years later, as well as one of the keystone and sort of key cornerstone parts of the Conservative manifesto, which was to ramp up the building of houses, a pledge of 300,000 homes per year, while reassuring that voters would retain the welfare state measures. We'll get to that question, the retaining of the welfare state, in a future lesson when we talk about Churchill as Prime Minister, because that general idea speaks to the concept of the post-war consensus that existed in the post-war world, in which both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party broadly agreed on a number of very important measures, such as the retaining of the welfare state. Labour would try to attack Churchill as a warmonger, prompting front-page headlines such as "Whose finger is on the trigger?", which was a direct action by Churchill against the Daily Mail, led to direct action. The Daily Mirror in the campaign. Essentially, the idea, one of the things that we'll also get to in a future lesson, is to understand Winston Churchill as somebody who cared probably a lot more about geopolitics than he did about domestic politics at this time. Remember, he was a wartime leader. He was elected, or he was appointed as Prime Minister in 1940, when the Second World War was raging, and then was removed from office in 1945 when the Second World War ended. So he had never really experienced the role of being a Prime Minister in peacetime. And also with the hottening up of the Cold War and the relationship between East and West, he seemed to have much more focus on things like the Soviets or on Korea and on China than he did on domestic politics. Now, polling shifted during the campaign. The Conservatives' lead narrowed from 7 points to only roughly 2.5% by election day, and so the election results were going to be very, very close. Labour won roughly 48.8% of the vote, roughly 14 million votes, and that garnered them 295 seats. Now, what's quite interesting is the Conservatives won slightly less. They won 48% of the vote. They won roughly 13 million votes, a few 100,000 less than the than the Labour Party. And they, however, got 321 seats, while the Liberals got around 700,000 votes, 2.5% of the vote, and that garnered them 6 seats. So for those of you who don't study politics at A-level, who are just doing history, for example, you might be thinking, well, why is that the case? How is it that Labour, that won more of the votes, more percentage of the vote, a greater percentage of the votes, managed to get so many less seats? They got nearly 30 less seats. Well, why is that the case? Well, the reason why Labour lost is because of the interesting system of electoral politics that we have in the United Kingdom. The first point of the reason why Labour lost was the collapse of the Liberal vote. The Liberal Party fielded only 106 candidates for the 1951 general election, which was down from 306 the previous year. Many former Liberal voters swung to the Conservatives at that point, especially in formerly marginal seats where Labour lost by narrow margins. So essentially, where there was a lack of Liberals to vote for, people instead voted for the Conservatives, and so that gave them a greater advantage with the collapse of the Liberal vote. In at least 14 constituencies where Labour lost, for example, Liberals were absent in the 1951 election, but had in fact stood in 1950. Voters shifted from the Conservatives then, which then swung the seat outcomes. The more important reason, however, is the vote efficiency and the safe seats. Essentially, in this country, you vote not for the leader of the party, you vote for your local MP, your local member of parliament. And the way it works is, the person with the most votes wins. So, theoretically, all you need to do to win a constituency seat in a British election is to get one more vote than second place. So if, for example, the Labour Party got 100 votes and the Conservative Party got 99 votes, then the Labour Party would win that entire constituency. They get that, and all of the Conservative votes are discounted. But that means that the inverse is then true. Let's say, for example, that the Conservatives won 250 votes. They got 250 votes in a constituency, and Labour only gets 50 votes. Well, in that case, the Conservatives win, they get the seat, but they got the seat with a huge number of votes. Most of those votes weren't needed. They're sometimes known as wasted votes. They are 200 votes ahead in that constituency, when theoretically the most efficient way of winning in that constituency would be to just get one vote more. And so this is really where the people who get more votes sometimes lose the most seats. Because in this situation, Labour had amassed a lot of votes. A lot of those votes that were for Labour came from already safe seats. They came from seats where Labour were already winning. And so what that did was boosted the overall number of people who voted for Labour in the country, but it didn't necessarily win any new constituencies. It just basically gave more votes to constituencies that they were already winning. By contrast, the Conservatives secured more seats with smaller margins. So they got less votes, but they got just enough votes to win the seats, which meant that they ended up winning more seats despite getting less votes. That's essentially how it works. It works like this even to this day. The first past the post system, first past the post refers to the first person who passes the finishing line, i.e. the first person to get the largest number of seats in the House of Commons, the first person to get the most votes in a particular constituency, and this is really where we say that you don't need something like a majority of the votes, you simply just need a plurality of the votes. The plurality of a vote means essentially the most votes of all of the candidates. Things get worse when you field multiple candidates. If, say, for example, you have 5 candidates running for an election in a particular constituency, then it might be the case that the winning person, the winning member of parliament who wins that constituency, the winning party, gets like 30% of the votes, because the rest of that, the other 70% of the votes, are split in between the other 4 candidates. So no one really gets anywhere near a majority, and so the person who gets the most votes wins, i.e. with less than a majority, with less than 50%. So that's the sort of quirks and the esoteric niches that take place in our electoral system. But fundamentally then, this election was very important in the sense that this marks the beginning of our studies for this topic in A-level history. It sees the returning of Winston Churchill to Downing Street, and it starts a 13-year period of Conservative rule, where we start to see the post-war consensus, but we then start to see a number of internal conflicts. You see the resignation of Churchill, you see the problems associated with Anthony Eden, you then see some of the problems associated with Harold Wilson, and then eventually we get the re-election of the Labour Party in 1964 under Harold Wilson. Harold Macmillan, sorry, is the person who I was, the Conservative who I was referring to there. So we'll get to all of that in future lessons' time. There are a lot of issues that are associated with this election. Of course, there's frequently cited as an example of a wrong winner problem, where first past the post essentially leads to more seats for a losing party than the other way around. But it generally opens the door to what becomes known as this sort of age of affluence, or the affluent society. More of that in future videos.